Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I woke up this morning, but how do I know I'm really awake? It's the kind of question that lingers in your mind, scratching at the edges of your thoughts until you can't tell where it started and where it ends. And after everything I've been through, after the things I've seen, I'm not sure what's real anymore. It started 2 weeks ago, or was it 3? Time doesn't make sense now. One moment, everything was normal, quiet evenings, long walks to the cafe, the hum of traffic in the distance. I was just like anyone else, living a life that had its ups and downs, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then came the event. I don't know what to call it, somewhere between a flash and a crack in the fabric of the world. I don't remember how it happened, only that one night, I walked into my apartment and everything changed. At first, I thought it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the stress from work or the late nights. Maybe I'd eaten something strange. But then the vision started, and I knew there was no denying it. They weren't like dreams. Dreams are soft, distant, like drifting through fog. These were sharp. Vivid, they had weight. It was like a veil had been lifted, and suddenly I was seeing things that weren't there, figures moving in the corners of my vision, shadows that lingered a second too long, faces in the reflections of windows that weren't mine. The first time it happened, I thought I was going insane. I'd just finished dinner, put the dishes away, and turned off the lights. The quiet of the apartment was almost too much, so I sat by the window, letting the cool night air filter in. And then, it happened. I looked across the street, and there she was. A woman, standing in the middle of the road. She was staring directly at me, her face pale and expressionless. Her clothes were old, tattered like they belonged to another time. I squinted, but she didn't move. I thought I was imagining it. I rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, she was still there. My heart began to pound. My mind raced to justify it. Maybe she was just a stranger, lost or waiting for someone. But no one else seemed to notice her. The streets were empty. The world was still, like I was the only one who could see her. I leaned forward, my breath fogging the glass. I reached for the handle to open the window, to call out, but just as my hand touched it, she was gone. Disappeared. Not a trace. I thought I'd imagined it, so I tried to forget about it. But it wasn't that easy. The next night, the same thing happened. Only this time, it wasn't a woman. It was a man, his face shadowed, but his eyes were like black holes. He was standing just outside the alley next to my building, his back to me. I didn't move. My legs froze to the floor. When I blinked, he was gone. But the feeling remained. That same heavy sensation, like I wasn't alone. Like there was something watching me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was stress. But then it kept happening. Each night, someone new would appear, a face, a shadow, a fleeting figure in the distance. Sometimes they were in the corner of my room, sometimes they were outside my window. Each time, they didn't speak. They just stood there, staring at me, as if waiting for something. What do they want? That's when I realized something even worse. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. During the day, everything seemed fine, but the moment night fell, the lines blurred. The apartment, my home, my safe place, turned into a maze. The walls seemed to stretch and shift. The corners were where they should be. I began to feel like I wasn't in control of my own space. Even when I tried to sleep, the dreams weren't normal. They were like waking moments, jarring, intense. The things I saw, heard, felt so real. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and hear someone calling my name, whispering in the dark. And when I opened my eyes, there would be nothing there. But the worst part was when I started hearing them even while I was wide awake. The first time I heard it clearly, I was sitting on the couch, reading a book. The clock ticked steadily, the only sound in the room when I heard it. A faint rustling, like the shifting of fabric. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then I heard a whisper, a name, soft and insistent. My name. I stood up, my heart racing, and looked around the apartment. There was no one. No one except me. But the whisper came again, closer this time. I could almost feel it in the air, brushing against my ear. Is someone here? I stumbled back, my mind spiraling. Was it just the wind again? Or was it something more? Something real? Something I couldn't see? And then, like a punch to the gut, I felt it. A presence. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it standing right behind me. Watching me. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I turned nothing. I thought I was losing my mind. It was the only explanation that made sense. But no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, the feeling, the voices, the figures, they kept coming back. And each time, they were closer. Always closer. The nights started to blend together, one long, unbroken stretch of unease and confusion. I couldn't remember the last time I had slept without waking up in a cold sweat, the weight of those figures still lingering in the corners of my mind. The apartment had become a prison. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, turned into a threat, a promise that something was watching, waiting. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. No, this had escalated to something far worse. It felt like I was becoming trapped inside a nightmare that I couldn't escape, a nightmare that stretched its tendrils into every waking moment of my life. I began to wonder, was this happening to me because of something I did, or was it always like this, and I just hadn't seen it until now? I thought maybe I could solve it if I just understood what was happening. If I could find the root of the problem, then maybe I could get back to normal. But every time I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that this was just a product of my tired mind, I found myself drawn deeper into this madness. I couldn't tell if it was exhaustion or fear anymore. Both seemed to blur together into a thick haze, making it hard to focus on anything else. I stopped going to work. My friends, who had texted and called, worried about me, stopped trying. I think they knew I had gone off the edge of reason. But it wasn't just the isolation that got to me. It was what I was seeing now, what I couldn't stop seeing. It started small. A flash of movement at the periphery of my vision. A figure, like someone darting around the corner of the hallway just outside my door. I would go to check, but there was nothing there. I didn't know when it started to feel so wrong. Maybe it was when I realized that the faces I saw weren't just reflections. Maybe it was when I stopped seeing myself in the mirror altogether. The mirror. I hadn't looked at myself in a while, but that day, I couldn't help it. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, my reflection staring back at me, except it wasn't quite right. My face, my expression, was distorted. The reflection seemed to move too slowly, as if it was a few seconds behind me, like it wasn't really me at all. I reached up to touch it, but when my fingers brushed against the glass, the reflection didn't mimic me. Instead, it grinned, just a flicker, but it was enough. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. My breath came in sharp, frantic gasps. It had been a mistake. A trick of the light. Maybe I was just tired. But then I saw something worse. I turned away, quickly, to escape that chilling sight, but when I looked back at the mirror, something had changed. The reflection was still there, but it wasn't mine. It was the woman, the one I'd seen outside my window that first night. She stood there in the mirror, her hollow eyes staring directly at me. Her pale lips didn't move, but somehow I could hear her speaking. "Come closer." I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, but the reflection didn't move. Not at first. It remained frozen, staring into me, its eyes so wide they seemed to consume the rest of her face. I ran from the bathroom, slamming the door behind me, but the image wouldn't leave my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing her voice, over and over, as if it was embedded in the walls themselves. My apartment had become her domain, and I was nothing more than a trespasser in it. I couldn't stay inside any longer. I grabbed my jacket and left, not caring where I was going. The streets were empty, as they always were at this hour, and the silence was suffocating. But as I walked, something felt wrong. My steps echoed too loudly against the pavement, and every shadow seemed to stretch further than it should have. That's when I saw it. The figure. Standing at the end of the street, its back to me. A tall man, his dark silhouette barely visible against the faint glow of the streetlights. I didn't recognize him, but he stood there like he was waiting for me. Like he knew I would be there. I froze. My body instinctively recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest, but something in me told me I had to approach. I had no choice. I moved toward him slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. As I got closer, I realized something that stopped me cold. The man had no face. Not like he was wearing a mask, but like there was nothing there at all. Just smooth, empty skin. A void where his features should have been. I could feel my stomach churn as I stepped closer, drawn by some invisible force. Suddenly, he turned. And for the first time, I saw something. His eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were like hollow pits. Dark, endless, and watching me. His mouth was a jagged line, stretched wide as if it had been torn open, revealing a set of uneven, sharp teeth. But the worst part? He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The world around me seemed to twist, to fold in on itself, like I was stepping through layers of glass, cracking apart with every step I took. The streetlights flickered and buzzed. The sky above me began to swirl, dark clouds twisting together like ink being poured into water. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was stuck in place, trapped in that moment, in that strange world where nothing made sense. And then I heard the voice again. "You're not awake, are you?" I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, the figure stepped closer, its face still missing, its hollow eyes drawing me in. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into that endless void. But in the back of my mind, a thought began to form. Was this all in my head? Was I dreaming? The more I thought about it, the less sure I became. And maybe that was the most terrifying part of all. I don't remember how I got home that night. I must have stumbled back in a daze, the streets around me like an endless blur, the figures still haunting my every step. The streetlights flickered in my periphery, casting distorted shadows that danced like twisted, disjointed versions of reality. I couldn't focus on anything except that empty, gaping face, those hollow eyes. Was it a dream? No, it couldn't have been. I could still feel the chill in the air, the unnerving silence that had blanketed everything, making it feel as though the world itself was holding its breath. I collapsed onto the couch when I finally made it back to my apartment. My body felt heavy, as if I were carrying something far greater than exhaustion, something pressing down on me, suffocating me. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. How could I? Every time I tried to rest, all I could see was the void, those dark pits where the man's eyes should have been. The apartment felt different now. Every creak of the floorboard, every shift of the furniture sent a jolt of panic through my body. The walls felt closer, as if they were closing in on me. And the voices. They were getting louder. At first, I thought they were in my head, a byproduct of the stress and fear. But now, they had a presence. A weight. They came from everywhere, the corners of the room, the floor beneath me, even from inside my own thoughts. Come closer. You can't escape. I pressed my hands to my ears, desperate to block them out, but it was useless. The words didn't stop. They echoed in the hollow spaces of my mind, reverberating through my bones. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, caught in a web of my own terror. It was then that I realized it wasn't just the man. It wasn't just the voices. Something was shifting. The apartment, my safe place, my sanctuary, had become alien. The furniture was out of place. The walls felt like they were bending inward, pressing on me from every angle. The air tasted metallic, sharp, like I was breathing in smoke. I stood up, my legs shaky, and moved toward the window. I needed to see the outside world. I needed to remind myself that there was something beyond this nightmare. But when I looked out, the street was gone. The city was gone. Instead, I saw vast, empty space, an endless void that stretched beyond my window, consuming everything. It was dark, yet not entirely black. The edges of the void flickered like dying lights, and there were shapes moving just beyond my vision. I blinked, unsure if my eyes were deceiving me. But when I looked again, the shapes were still there, figures, faint and blurry, shifting in and out of existence like ghosts. I stepped back from the window, my heart racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the longer I stood there, the more it felt like I was sinking into this void, being pulled into its darkness. They're waiting for you. The voice was clearer now, sharper, like it was coming from just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the empty room, the creeping shadows, the silence that suffocated every breath. The walls groaned again, louder this time, as if they were alive. I felt something shift within me, something deep and primal, a sense that I had overstayed my welcome in this place. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone. I wasn't even sure if I ever had been. The apartment had become something else, something unfamiliar, something that didn't belong in the world I once knew. And the more I looked around, the more I saw things that shouldn't be there. A figure standing at the edge of my vision, its back turned toward me, like it was watching me, waiting for me to notice. The walls flickering like static on an old TV, the shadows warping and twisting like living things. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Come closer. The voice wasn't in my head anymore. It was real. The figure at the edge of the room, it was real. It stepped forward, just a little, just enough for me to see its face. It was her. The woman. The one from the mirror. The one I'd seen in the corner of my vision, the one who had been waiting for me. Her face was pale, stretched thin, the skin pulled tight over her bones like a mask. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and they glowed with an unnatural light, an eerie, sickly yellow that burned into my retinas. Her mouth twisted into a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that was far too wide, too sharp. You don't belong here. Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear, cutting through the air like a blade, filling the room with a deafening presence. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my feet were stuck to the floor. I was trapped in this moment, trapped in this place that wasn't real, that wasn't mine. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman vanished. I blinked. For a moment, the room seemed normal again. The shadows retreated. The air felt breathable, and the walls stopped groaning. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. They're all here. Waiting for you. The voices, the figures, the shadows, they were all closing in. And I had no idea how to escape. I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The air had grown heavier, thicker with the presence of something not quite right, something that hung in the corners of every room. The shadows seemed to stretch longer with every passing moment, as though they were alive, waiting for me to make a move so they could pounce. I grabbed my jacket, my hands trembling as I shoved it on. My heart was pounding, and my breath was shallow. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out, to escape from the suffocating grip of this place. But where could I go? Where could I run when everything, even the street outside, felt like it was closing in on me? The door slammed shut behind me with an unnatural force as I stepped into the hallway. The silence was overwhelming, as if the world had been muted. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the narrow corridor, like they were being amplified by some unseen force. But as I walked down the hall, I began to notice something strange. The walls were changing, shifting. I had walked down this same hallway countless times before, yet now it felt wrong. The once familiar wallpaper had peeled away, revealing dark, damp wood beneath. The ceiling was lower, the air colder. And the doors, there were too many of them now. I hadn't remembered seeing this many doors before. I had passed the same few rooms every day, but now there were new doors, lined up like they were always meant to be there, leading to places I had never seen. Each door was slightly ajar, as though inviting me to look inside. But I knew better than to peek behind them. As I approached the staircase, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. It was fleeting, just a shadow passing quickly in the periphery, but my pulse quickened. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the growing sense of dread that clawed at the back of my mind. I didn't want to go back to my apartment. But the thought of being outside, in the city, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and unfamiliar streets, felt equally terrifying. It was as if the world outside had become just as strange and hostile as the one within. I made my way down the staircase, the old wood creaking beneath my feet. Each step was like a countdown, each movement a reminder that I couldn't outrun what was happening. When I reached the lobby, the door to the street was locked. It had never been locked before. I rattled the handle, pulling on it, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic began to set in. I ran my hands over my face, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I must have imagined it all, the figure, the woman, the voices. It was all just a product of my mind, a series of twisted thoughts that I couldn't make sense of. But then, I heard the sound. A soft, almost inaudible scratching at the door. I froze, my heart stopping for a second. The sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a stray animal. It was something, or someone, scratching, trying to get in. The sound grew louder, more frantic. I backed away, my breath quickening. I had to get out. I had to find a way to leave. I turned and ran back toward the staircase, but as I did, something strange happened. The hallway, the stairwell, began to stretch. The walls were growing farther apart, the space expanding like I was walking through an infinite tunnel. The doors, now lining both sides of the hall, seemed to multiply with every step I took. I couldn't stop moving. I didn't know how to stop. Then I saw her again. The woman. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her back turned to me. Her hair, long and matted, hung in front of her face, obscuring her features. But I could see the outline of her figure, her thin, gaunt frame, standing motionless in the dim light. "You can't escape," the voice whispered, low and slow, echoing in the hollow space around me. I could feel the ground beneath me tremble. The walls were moving again, closing in on me. The hallways seemed to shrink, the doors pressing closer, their handles turning on their own. The woman didn't move. But her presence, it was suffocating. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I ran, faster now, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get away from her, from this place, from whatever nightmare had taken root in my mind. But every time I looked back, the woman was closer. Her thin fingers stretched out toward me, her mouth opening slightly, revealing rows of sharp, yellow teeth. Her smile grew wider, too wide for her face, stretching beyond what was humanly possible. "You belong here," she hissed, her voice louder now, like it was coming from inside my head. I reached the door at the end of the hallway, my only escape, but when I turned the handle, it wouldn't open. I pulled, desperately, but it was stuck, the metal cold and unyielding beneath my hands. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, my chest tight with fear, and saw her standing there, her face now inches from mine. Her eyes, those glowing yellow eyes, were wide, unblinking. The smile on her face was now a grotesque, distorted thing, and I felt the chill of her breath on my skin. "You can't leave." The words, the warning, the truth, it hit me all at once. There was no escaping this place. There was no escaping her. The room around me seemed to shudder, and then everything went dark. I awoke with a jolt, my body shivering violently, as though I had just come back from a place too cold, too far. My heart hammered against my chest, and my breath was ragged, shallow, like I had been running for miles, desperately trying to escape something I couldn't see. But when I opened my eyes, everything was normal. The familiar hum of the old apartment building filled my ears. The soft glow of the morning sun filtered through the dusty curtains, casting pale light across the room. The air smelled faintly of coffee, something comforting, grounding. It was the same as it always had been, but the cold dread still clung to me like a shadow. I sat up in bed, wiping the sweat from my forehead. I could still feel her presence, her voice echoing in my head. "You can't leave." The words twisted through my thoughts, sinking deep under my skin. My hands trembled as I touched my face, feeling the sharpness of my own reality, trying to remind myself that I was here, that I had made it through the night. But something was wrong. The apartment didn't feel like mine anymore. It was as if it had been replaced by something else, a version of itself that was slightly off, slightly warped. The shadows didn't fall the way they used to. The corners of the room felt like they were closing in, like the walls were bending inward. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. As I walked across the room, I saw the reflection of myself in the old, cracked mirror. But it wasn't me looking back. At least, not entirely. The face in the mirror was pale, gaunt. Hollowed eyes stared back at me, wide and unblinking, as though I were staring at someone else's reflection, someone who didn't belong in this world. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the glass, but the reflection didn't move the way I did. It lingered, like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to make the next move. I stumbled back, gasping for air, trying to shake off the sensation of being watched. The room had become oppressive, the silence around me louder than ever. The clock on the wall ticked with a slow, deliberate beat, each second dragging longer than the last. And then I heard it again, the scratching sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but no, it was real. Coming from the hallway outside my apartment door, the faint sound of nails dragging against wood. It wasn't just any noise, it was purposeful, deliberate. I hesitated. I didn't want to know what it was, but the need to confirm my worst fear was stronger than my sense of self-preservation. Slowly, I crept toward the door, my hand gripping the cold handle. I pulled it open just a crack, enough to peer into the hallway. And there, at the end of the corridor, was the figure again. The woman. She was standing motionless in the middle of the hall, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, like a bird observing its prey. Her long, matted hair hung loosely over her face, hiding her features, but I could still feel her eyes on me, sharp, cold, and relentless. The faint scraping noise came from her direction, as though she was dragging her fingers across the wall in anticipation. I wanted to slam the door shut. I wanted to hide, to lock myself away and pretend that this was all just a horrible, lingering nightmare. But my body wouldn't cooperate. My legs refused to move, my fingers frozen to the door as I watched her. Suddenly, she began to move, her head snapping to the side with a speed that made me flinch. It wasn't human, not in any sense I could comprehend. Her movements were jerky, twitching, as though every step was a struggle against something far worse than gravity. She began to walk toward me. Each step was slow at first, dragging across the floor like the creak of bones. But then she ran. I slammed the door shut with a force I didn't know I had, my heart racing, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But where? There was no escape. The walls of this place had become a prison, and the woman, she was the warden, bound to it, bound to me. I backed away from the door, trying to collect my breath, my mind spinning with the fragments of reality that didn't make sense. Was she real? Was I? Was I awake, or was this another part of the nightmare? I turned toward the window, desperate for anything that could anchor me to the world outside. The sky outside was a dull gray, the cityscape stretching endlessly. But as I looked closer, I saw the figures. They were everywhere. The people. The faces I hadn't seen before, appearing like they were watching me from the streets below. Their expressions were blank, their movements mechanical, like they were part of some grand illusion. Some of them raised their heads to stare up at me, their eyes hollow and dead, not a single glimmer of recognition in their gaze. And then the woman's voice came again. You can't leave. The words were inside my head. No, not just inside. It was as if they were vibrating through the very air, rippling the space around me. I pressed my hands against my temples, but it was no use. The sensation of something other was everywhere now, pressing against my thoughts, my sanity. It wasn't just a nightmare. This was real. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't tell where the illusion ended and the reality began. I stumbled back from the window, my legs giving way beneath me. My body felt heavier with each passing second, like I was drowning in my own fear. And then the door rattled again. I couldn't escape. I couldn't escape the woman, and I couldn't escape my own mind. And maybe I never had a chance to begin with. It was the kind of dream you could feel in your bones, something more than just a fleeting image in the dark. It haunted me even when I woke up. The forgotten dreams, they had returned, and they needed to tell their story. But what if that story wasn't meant for me? The first thing I noticed when I opened my eyes was the silence. The room, though familiar, felt like it was holding its breath. I lay still for a moment, letting the darkness blur around the edges of my vision. It had always been this way in the early hours of the morning. Everything seemed muted, almost fragile. But today, it was different. Something felt wrong. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the night pressing against my chest. The air in the room was stale, as though it had been trapped here for days. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I moved toward the window, the pale light of dawn barely seeping through the curtains. Outside, the world was still, too still. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I felt a cold shiver run up my spine, but I dismissed it. Maybe it was just the remnants of the dream still clinging to my mind, twisting reality into something darker. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized something was different. There was a weight to the silence now, as if something was holding it down. I turned back toward the room. The shadows seemed deeper, more defined than they should be. The corners of the room stretched unnaturally, the shapes blurring in and out of focus. My breath caught in my throat, but I tried to shake it off. I was just tired. I hadn't slept well. But then I heard it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible at first. The faintest rustle, like something moving just out of sight. I froze. The sound came again, this time louder. A faint scratching. A whisper of movement. It was coming from the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to gather, thick and unnatural. My heart began to race. I took a cautious step forward, my pulse quickening. The scratching stopped, replaced by an almost suffocating stillness. I felt something cold creeping up my spine, and I knew, somehow, that I wasn't alone anymore. I glanced around, but the room looked the same. The walls, the furniture, everything in its place. Except the air. It was thick now, like it had been replaced with something else, something that didn't belong. Then I heard it. A soft whisper, just behind my ear. Come back. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the empty, shadowed room. The walls seemed to stretch further now, the space closing in around me. The whisper came again, louder this time. Come back to us. My mind raced. My heart pounded in my chest. It was just a trick, I told myself. My own mind playing games. But why was it so hard to breathe? Why did the shadows feel like they were watching me? I stepped back, my feet brushing against the cold floor, and as I turned to leave the room, I heard a faint, unearthly sound. A sound that felt so wrong, so unnatural, that I could feel it reverberate through my bones. It was the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, walking in time with my own. But when I turned around, the room was empty. The shadows had grown darker, and the silence felt unbearable. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, and tried to steady my breath. The footsteps hadn't stopped. They were still there, echoing in my mind like a dull drumbeat, matching the rhythm of my panic. I forced myself to take another step, my eyes scanning the room, the walls, the corners. The shadows were still, but something about them felt alive. I told myself to stop being irrational. It's just the stress. Just the dream messing with me, I muttered under my breath. But the words did nothing to ease the tight knot in my stomach. The room felt like it was pressing in on me. The walls seemed to bend closer, as though the space itself was warping. My head was heavy, thoughts tangled and scrambled. The air around me felt thicker now, as if it were absorbing everything, suffocating every ounce of light, every fleeting thought. I took another step, my feet dragging across the floor, when something flickered in the corner of my vision. A shadow moved, subtle, almost imperceptible. But it was there. I turned sharply, my eyes locked onto the spot. There was nothing there, nothing tangible, at least. Yet I could feel it. The weight of a presence, something unseen but undeniably real. It had always been a strange thing, the way certain places could make you feel like you were being watched, but this was something else. I moved toward the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The sound of my own breath seemed too loud, too frantic. The moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, a sharp, sudden noise broke the silence. A crack. A snap. It came from somewhere behind me. My heart lurched in my chest, my body frozen in place. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just stood there, my hand still on the door, as the crackling sound continued, growing louder, closer. It wasn't just a noise anymore. It was something living. Please, just stop, I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible, as if the shadows themselves could hear. But they didn't stop. They moved closer. The air in the room seemed to hum, a low vibration, like the space itself was charged with something otherworldly. The whispering began again. Soft, distant at first, but unmistakable, come back. I yanked the door open, not caring if it was rational, if it made sense. I needed to leave. But as the door creaked open, the silence that followed was almost worse. The hallway beyond was dark, its shadows deeper than they should have been. It was a hallway I knew well, a hallway I had walked through hundreds of times. But now, it was wrong. Everything was wrong. I stepped into the hall, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. A cold draft swept through the narrow space, and the faintest scent of something decaying filled the air. My pulse quickened. There was something moving in the dark. I could feel it, just out of reach. I moved cautiously, every step echoing louder than the last. The hallway stretched out before me, but instead of the familiar doorways, I saw nothing but dark voids. Empty spaces. The walls seemed to ripple, shifting like liquid, distorting the once clear lines of the corridor. And the shadows, they weren't shadows anymore. They were shapes. Shapes that moved. I paused in the middle of the hallway, a sense of dread washing over me. I couldn't make out the shapes clearly, but I could feel them. They were closing in on me. The air felt colder, the space narrowing. I turned to run, but the floor beneath me seemed to tilt, pulling me toward one of the dark voids. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My mouth was dry, my throat tight. I was trapped in this space, this corridor that seemed to stretch forever. And still, I could hear the footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. They weren't mine. "Come back," the voice whispered again, now closer, so close it felt like it was inside my head. I turned, frantic, but there was nothing there. Just the hallway. Just the shifting shadows. But then, at the very end of the hall, I saw it. A figure. It was faint at first, just a blur, but as it stepped into the dim light, I could see its shape, tall, thin, its limbs too long. Its head hung at an unnatural angle, like it had been twisted to an impossible degree. The figure moved toward me, its steps unearthingly silent, and the floor beneath me seemed to buckle, warping like the walls. I couldn't breathe. The thing reached out, its fingers long and pale, reaching for me. I stumbled backward, trying to break free from the grip of the air around me, but it was like I was moving through water, slow, heavy, and utterly futile. And then, just as it touched my shoulder, I woke up. I sat up in bed, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My heart hammered in my chest, my hands trembling. I looked around, trying to calm myself, trying to convince myself that it was just a dream. But the room, the same room, felt colder than it should. I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't just a nightmare. Something had followed me. Something was waiting for me. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was shrinking around me, the walls closing in, squeezing the air from my lungs. The lingering sense of dread from the dream clung to me, heavy and suffocating. My heart was still pounding, each beat like a drum in my ears. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that went beyond the nightmare. I stood up from the bed, my legs weak, and moved toward the window, pulling the curtains open. Daylight should have brought relief, but it didn't. The sky was gray, the air thick and still. The sun seemed to be hidden behind a veil of clouds, casting everything in a dull, lifeless light. I should have felt comforted by the normalcy of the morning, but I didn't. There was a weight to the silence outside, a sense that the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. I turned away from the window, my eyes scanning the room again, almost expecting something to appear. The same familiar room, but it wasn't the same anymore. The shadows seemed deeper, and the stillness, that oppressive silence, was too much. It felt wrong. It felt watched. The air tasted different now. The scent of old wood and dust was replaced with something else, something sharp, metallic, like blood. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to calm myself, to tell myself that it was just a lingering effect of the dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. I walked toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. But before I could touch it, there was a noise. A faint sound, a creaking, like someone walking on the floorboards just outside. I froze. It wasn't my imagination. I had heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I stood there, in the middle of the room, listening. The footsteps grew louder, slow and deliberate, like they were pacing, moving just out of sight. But I couldn't see anyone. The hallway was empty. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I felt rooted to the spot, like I was waiting for something. waiting for it to come closer. The sound of footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was more deafening than anything. It pressed in on me, making it hard to think, to breathe. I turned my head slowly, looking toward the door. The shadows near it seemed to stretch out longer than they should, curling like fingers reaching for me. The air around the door felt colder, almost icy. I wanted to open the door and run, but something stopped me. Something deep in my gut told me that if I did, I would never come back. And then I heard it again. A whisper. This time, it was louder, clearer. Come back to us. The voice was soft, but it had a resonance to it, as if it was echoing through the walls of my mind. It sounded familiar, and that was what terrified me the most. The voice sounded like someone I had known, someone I had forgotten. Someone from a time long buried in the corners of my memory. I moved toward the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I couldn't let it control me. I had to face it. I had to know what was waiting for me. I pulled the door open. The hallway outside was the same as I remembered, yet it wasn't. The walls were dull and faded, the floorboards creaking under my weight, but there was a strange, oppressive quality to the space. The air was thick with that same metallic scent, and I felt like I was walking through a dream, the edges of reality blurring with something darker. The whispering was louder now. It was all around me, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, calling me. I moved down the hallway, my steps hesitant, every sound amplifying in the silence. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, twisting, reaching. And then I saw it. At the end of the hall, in the dim light, a figure stood. I couldn't make out its features at first. It was just a silhouette, too tall, too thin. Its shape was wrong, bending in ways that no human form should. It stood perfectly still, as if waiting for me to approach. The air around it seemed to pulse, thick and heavy, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if it was studying me. Its movements were slow, deliberate. And then it spoke. "You remember," the voice rasped. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was inside my head, a thought, a memory, a question. "Don't you?" I took a step back, my heart racing, my mouth dry. The figure took a step forward, its limbs stretching unnaturally, elongating, as if defying the rules of the world. The hallway was closing in on me, the walls warping and shifting, the shadows turning into shapes, figures, faces. I could see them now, flickering in the corner of my vision, memories, forgotten faces, eyes that watched me from the darkness. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air was thick around me, heavy with the weight of something ancient. The walls were closing in, the space narrowing until there was nothing but the figure, its face now visible in the dim light. It wasn't human. It was something else. Something old. The figure reached out with its long, gnarled fingers, and the hallway went dark. Completely dark. I could still feel its presence, hovering just behind me, waiting. The shadows were closing in, and I knew deep down that I would never escape this place. Not this time. The whisper came again, clearer than ever, filling my mind. "Come back to us." And then everything went silent. I woke up again, gasping for breath, as if I had been underwater for hours. My chest heaved, the air was cold, and I could still feel the lingering presence, the weight of something watching me. The shadows from the dream bled into the room, stretching unnaturally across the walls, distorting the familiar surroundings. I looked around, disoriented. The room was empty, just like it had been when I went to bed. But it didn't feel empty. The silence was suffocating, almost oppressive. It pressed down on me from every direction. The dream, or whatever that had been, hadn't just been a nightmare. It was real. I could still feel the figure's cold, hollow stare on my skin. My head was spinning. I tried to focus, to find my bearings, but it was as if the world around me was unraveling. The edges of my vision blurred, the room swirling like a bad painting, nothing in focus, just shapes and colors mixing in ways they shouldn't. I stumbled out of bed, my legs unsteady. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this room that felt so wrong. I needed to get out. I needed to move. I walked to the door, my hand trembling as it gripped the cold metal handle. I opened it and stepped into the hallway. The same hallway from the dream. It was exactly as I had seen it, down to the faint cracks in the walls, the dust coating the floorboards. But it was wrong. It was too real. I felt the sensation again, the one that had clawed at me in the dream. Like someone was standing just behind me, watching me. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't face it. The longer I stood there, the closer the presence felt. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat growing louder and louder in my ears. There were no footsteps, no whispers this time. But the air felt heavy with something that didn't belong. I turned left, moving down the hall toward the stairs. I could hear the house creaking around me, the wood groaning as if it were alive, shifting under the weight of my steps. The house seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in rhythm with my movements. The further I went, the more suffocating the air became. It was thick with an unspoken tension, as if something had changed. Had I changed? Was this place still the same, or had it transformed, just like my mind had? I reached the top of the stairs. The landing stretched out before me, leading to more dark, endless hallways. The house felt alive, like it was aware of me. The walls were pressing in, like the house itself was trying to swallow me whole. Every door I passed was cracked open, and I could swear I saw shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting something to be there, but there was nothing. Nothing except the suffocating silence. A strange, sudden noise broke through the stillness. It was faint, but unmistakable, or rustling, as if someone was shifting in the next room. A slow, deliberate movement, like the sound of someone taking cautious steps across the floor. I wasn't imagining it. The sound was real. It was here. The rustling grew louder, more urgent. I felt my stomach twist. Was I alone in this house? Was this part of the nightmare, or was it something else? I couldn't stay here. I had to move, had to find out what it was. But a part of me wanted to run, to leave the house entirely and never look back. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My feet felt heavy, my legs like lead, but I forced myself to move. I turned the corner, following the sound. It led me to the old study, a room I hadn't entered in years. The door was ajar, and the rustling was louder now, like papers being shuffled. I pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a thin beam of sunlight cutting through the dust-choked air. The shelves were lined with old books, their spines cracked and faded. The furniture was covered in sheets, ghostly remnants of a life that had long been forgotten. And yet, it was all so familiar. Everything felt wrong, but in a way that almost made sense. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. The rustling noise stopped the moment I crossed the threshold. The room fell silent. Too silent. I looked around, but there was no one. Nothing moved. The air was thick, pressing against my skin as though it were watching me. But then, I noticed it. On the desk in the center of the room, there was a piece of paper. It wasn't there before. I would have remembered it. It was too new. Too clean. I approached it slowly, my hand still trembling. The paper was blank at first glance, but as I got closer, I saw it, faint, scribbled words. Words that I hadn't written. Words that didn't belong. Come back to us. The same words. The same voice from the dream. My mind screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the page. The room felt as if it were closing in on me, the walls pressing against my ribs. I was suffocating. And then I heard it again. The whisper. But this time, it wasn't just in my head. It came from somewhere behind me. Come back. I spun around, my heart leaping in my chest. The room was empty, but the door was now completely shut. The light outside was dimming. The shadows, the ones I had seen in the hallway, were moving again. The whisper came again, louder this time. Come back to us. And then, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was tall, its limbs long and gaunt, twisting at impossible angles. Its face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me. Cold. Empty. Hollow. I didn't know how, but I knew. This was it. This was what had been calling me, what had been waiting for me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure stepped forward, its form distorting with each movement, and the room plunged into darkness. The darkness engulfed me like a suffocating blanket, thick and all-encompassing. The air turned colder, sharper, as if the temperature itself was bending, warping around the presence that filled the room. My breath came in ragged gasps, echoing in the silence. I couldn't see anything, nothing but black. But I could feel it. The figure was still there, somewhere in the room, and it was moving closer. The floorboards creaked under its weight, each step deliberate and slow, like a predator circling its prey. My chest tightened, a wave of panic crashing over me. I knew I had to move. I had to run. But my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, caught in a nightmare where every instinct screamed at me to flee, but my limbs refused to obey. Come back, the whisper came again, this time so close it sent a shiver down my spine. The voice was low, raspy, but filled with a terrible familiarity that made my blood run cold. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I wanted to scream, but the sound got stuck in my throat. The shadows shifted. I could hear the rustle of fabric, too loud, too close. I wanted to back away, to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot. The whisper came again, but this time it was not just a voice. It was a feeling. It was in my bones, in the marrow of my spine, deep down, tugging at something inside of me. Come back to us. The air felt heavier with each passing second, pressing against me like a physical force. The walls seemed to move, to pulse, breathing in time with the figure's steps. I thought I saw something, a flash of movement, the faintest outline of a face. It wasn't human. Its features were twisted, malformed, as if it had once been something else, something familiar, but had been warped, disfigured, stretched to an unnatural point. The shadow of the thing bent unnaturally, its body elongated and distorted in ways that no human form should be able to take. It reached out, its long fingers brushing against the air, as though testing the space between us. The movement was too slow, too deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. I could feel its presence, as though it was inside my mind, circling through my thoughts. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. And I felt it, the sensation of something cold, sharp, pressing against my skin. Its touch was like ice, biting into me. I gasped, a surge of adrenaline flooding my veins. I had to move. I had to get out. Without thinking, I lunged forward, stumbling over my own feet as I sprinted toward the door. The darkness pressed in, the walls narrowing, but I didn't care. I had to escape. The feeling of something reaching for me, something following, was unbearable. I slammed into the door, pushing it open with all the strength I could muster. The hallway was still dark, but the sense of oppressive weight was gone. For a moment, I thought I had escaped, that the nightmare was finally over. But then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and close. I turned around, my breath ragged, my pulse hammering in my ears. But there was nothing. No figure. No shape. Just darkness. I started walking, my feet moving on their own, as though I was being guided by some invisible force. The hallway stretched out before me, the silence almost unbearable now. My hands trembled at my sides, my mind spinning, unsure of what was real and what wasn't. I passed door after door, each one closed, but I could feel the weight of each one as if they were hiding something behind them. Something that was waiting for me. Suddenly, the floor creaked behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. There, at the end of the hallway, stood the figure. It was different this time. The shadows around it were darker, thicker, almost tangible, as if they were alive. The figure was taller now, looming, its arms stretched out unnaturally long, its fingers bent and twitching. Its face was something I couldn't quite look at. It was like staring at the void itself, a blackness so complete that it defied recognition. And then, in that moment, I understood. This was no dream. This was no figment of my imagination. This was real. Whatever this thing was, it had been waiting for me. It had always been here, lurking just beneath the surface of my memories. You remember, it whispered, and its voice was not just in the air. It was in my head. Inside my thoughts. You know who we are. The air grew colder still, the temperature plummeting, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but the fear was paralyzing. I was trapped. Trapped in this hallway, with no escape, no way out. The walls were closing in, the darkness swirling around me. I could feel the walls pressing on me. The house, the very air itself, was turning against me, as if it were alive, feeding off my fear. The ground beneath my feet was trembling, shifting, like the entire structure was on the verge of collapsing. And then, with a sudden jolt, the figure lunged forward. Its form blurred, stretched, until it was right in front of me. The last thing I saw was its face, or what could have been a face, before everything went black. When I awoke, I was lying on the floor of the study, the same study where everything had begun. The room was empty. Silent. But the air felt thick, oppressive. I could still feel it, the presence. The shadows. They were everywhere. Watching. Waiting. And then, in the corner of the room, something caught my eye. A small object, half hidden beneath the desk. I approached it slowly, my hands trembling. I reached down and picked it up. It was a ring. A broken ring. The same one I had thrown away, the same one that had appeared in my dreams. I clenched it tightly in my hand. It had never left. And neither had they. The whispers returned. Come back to us. It was during one of my nightly walks that I first felt it, the sensation that the darkness itself was alive. At first, it was nothing more than an uncomfortable unease. A strange, tingling feeling crawling under my skin. I had been walking through the familiar streets, the ones I had walked 1,000 times before. Yet tonight, something was different. The shadows that clung to the corners of the houses seemed darker, deeper. They shifted, even though there was no wind. I stopped for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling. The street was empty, quiet. Only the sound of my shoes echoing against the pavement broke the silence. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I glanced around, but there was nothing, just the familiar, dim light of the street lamps casting long, twisted shapes on the ground. Then I heard it. A whisper, soft and barely audible, but unmistakable. It was as if the night itself was speaking, its voice muffled, distant, as though it was trying to tell me something or warn me. Do you hear us? The whisper seemed to wrap itself around my mind, too soft to be real, yet it felt so true. I froze. My heart began to race. I looked around again, but there was nothing. No one. Just the endless expanse of a darkened street. I shook my head, dismissing it as a trick of the wind. But the unease remained, a weight pressing down on me. I took a deep breath and continued walking, faster this time. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more distinct with every step. The night was heavy now, suffocating. Each breath felt thicker, like the air itself had changed. The shadows seemed to stretch out farther, creeping along the edges of my vision. As I passed an alleyway, I thought I saw something, a movement, a flash of a figure in the corner of my eye. I stopped again, this time more cautiously. Nothing. But the feeling was stronger now, more undeniable. Something was there. Something was waiting. I quickened my pace, turning onto a side street. The atmosphere had shifted. The comforting hum of the city, the distant sounds of life, all faded into the background. It was as if the world had closed in around me, leaving only me and the creeping darkness. And then, I heard it again. The whisper. It was closer now. I could feel it, like fingers brushing against the back of my neck. Come closer. The words were not spoken aloud. They were inside my head, an invasive thought that wasn't mine. I stumbled, my heart racing, as I turned a corner and found myself on an unfamiliar street. The houses here looked different, older, their windows black and empty like hollow eyes staring into the void. The air felt heavier, like the weight of the entire street was pressing in on me. I tried to turn back, but the shadows seemed to move, blocking my path. The street I had come from was gone. It was like the city itself had shifted, rearranged itself around me. I felt a cold chill settle in the air, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something, a figure standing in the distance, barely visible in the thick darkness. It was still, watching. I was paralyzed, my feet glued to the ground. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it, its presence, heavy and suffocating. The whisper returned, this time sharper, more insistent. You can't leave. Not yet. The words struck me like a blow to the chest. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Something inside me snapped, panic, confusion, fear all coursed through me like electricity. I turned to run, but the darkness closed in around me, the shadows swallowing up everything I knew. As I ran, I could feel the walls of the street shifting, warping. I wasn't on the same street anymore. The familiar world had changed, replaced by a place I couldn't understand. The shadows danced in the corners of my eyes, pulling at me, urging me to follow them. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to get away. And then, as I turned another corner, I saw it. The figure. But it wasn't just a figure anymore. It had shape, form. It was moving now, its limbs twisting unnaturally, like something that was not meant to be seen in the light of day. Its face, was it even a face? Or just an absence of one? Hollow eyes stared back at me, and I could feel the darkness radiating from it, seeping into my skin. I stopped, frozen, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was getting closer, its movements slow, deliberate, like it was savoring my fear. You can't escape, it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. You never could. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. This thing, it wasn't just some figment of my imagination. It was real. And it was coming for me. I couldn't breathe. My body refused to move, as if the very air had turned to lead, weighing me down. The figure stood before me now, a grotesque parody of life, its limbs stretching and jerking at angles like a marionette with broken strings. It had no face, no mouth to speak, yet the words echoed in my mind with terrifying clarity. You can't escape. The darkness around me seemed to pulse, alive and breathing, thickening, pressing in from all sides. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't obey. Every inch of my body screamed to flee, but I was trapped, ensnared in the presence of this thing. The air was suffocating, heavy with a chill that seeped into my bones, freezing me in place. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The figure moved closer, its limbs twitching unnaturally, dragging itself toward me with a sickening slowness. I could see its body, a twisted silhouette, covered in an oily black substance that shimmered under the faint light from the street lamps. It was like something that shouldn't exist, a mass of shadows, held together by some terrible force. We've been waiting for you, the whisper came again, but this time it was louder, more forceful. For so long, it was not a voice I could understand. It was more of a sensation, an emotion pressed directly into my mind. Fear, hunger, a hunger that seemed to go beyond physical needs. This thing wanted something from me. It needed something from me. I stumbled backward, still unable to look away. The alley seemed to stretch farther behind it, endless, as if the space itself had twisted, making escape impossible. The walls of the buildings around me had become tall, oppressive, closing in. The night sky was gone, swallowed up by a void that reached down like an endless abyss. I was suffocating, trapped in this unnatural place. In desperation, I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my mind. This isn't real, I told myself. It's not real. This is just a nightmare. Wake up. But the reality was undeniable. My body was trembling, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. This thing was real. It had to be. A low, almost melodic hum started to vibrate through the ground beneath me, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had been waiting, buried deep beneath the surface of the world. The figure stopped in front of me, its movement halting as it tilted its head, or perhaps it was not a head at all. The movement was so unnatural, so wrong, that I couldn't tell what was happening. "You've always known," the voice whispered again, sending a jolt of ice through my veins. "You've always known the darkness, deep inside you." The words slithered through my thoughts like venom, and for the first time, I felt a gnawing sense of recognition. The darkness it spoke of. I had always known it. It was something that lived inside me, something I had buried so deep that I had long ago convinced myself it didn't exist. But now, it was awake. It was clawing its way back to the surface. I could feel my pulse racing, my breath coming faster. The figure's hollow eyes were locked onto mine, its presence filling the space around me, suffocating, oppressive. It was as if it was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every passing second. I tried to turn away, but the alley had morphed into something unrecognizable. The path I had taken was gone. The buildings had become nothing more than twisted, gnarled shapes, their outlines shifting and warping. I was surrounded, lost in a maze of shadows that seemed to reach out toward me. "There is no escape," the voice said again, growing louder, more insistent. "There is only acceptance." My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, my hands scraping against the rough, cold pavement. My head spun, my body shaking uncontrollably. The thing was getting closer, its figure expanding, filling the space around me. It was no longer just a figure, it was the embodiment of the darkness itself. The shadows wrapped around me, clinging to my skin, filling my lungs, suffocating me. "You are ours now," it hissed, the voice now layered with a chorus of otherworldly sounds. "Always." I could feel it then, the pressure, the weight of the darkness pressing against my chest. It was crushing me, consuming me, and there was nothing I could do. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the horror, but when I opened them again, the figure was gone. The alley was empty. But the darkness remained. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was I dreaming? The shadows seemed to have faded, but the air still felt heavy, like it was soaked in something unnatural. I couldn't breathe properly, the air tasted thick, metallic. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was inside my head, clear and unmistakable. "This is only the beginning." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. Only the beginning? I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear, whatever this was, it wasn't going to let me go. Not now. Not ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Even after the alley was behind me, and the night returned to its familiar, mundane stillness, the sense of being watched gnawed at the edges of my mind. The shadows clung to me, wrapping around my thoughts like a tightening noose. I had to get away. I had to leave this place, but where could I go? The whole city seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something, some unseen force, to make its move. I walked faster, my footsteps echoing against the damp concrete, but the weight of the night pressed down on me. The streets felt narrower, suffocating, like I was trapped in some twisted version of reality. Each shadow stretched unnaturally long, twitching as if alive. The air was thick with a metallic scent, sharp and suffocating. It smelled of decay, of something long forgotten. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see the creature from the alley, its inhuman form lurking in the darkness behind me. But there was nothing. Just the empty streets, the flickering street lamps casting strange, elongated shadows across the pavement. I tried to tell myself that I was being irrational, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the terror in my chest was undeniable. The whisper from before echoed in my mind again. This is only the beginning. I shuddered, shaking my head to clear the thought. I couldn't afford to think like this. It was just a hallucination. Just a bad dream. But as I walked further, the world around me continued to twist. Buildings that had once been familiar now loomed over me like towering monoliths, their windows dark and empty, their outlines sharp and jagged, as if the very fabric of reality was breaking apart. The air felt heavier, more oppressive. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift ever so slightly, like the earth itself was moving. A soft rustling sound reached my ears, like leaves stirred by the wind. But there were no leaves here. Only the grim silence of the city at night. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound grew louder, closer. I glanced around, but saw nothing. It's just the wind, I told myself, trying to steady my breath. Just the wind. But the rustling continued, more deliberate now, as if something or someone was moving behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the same empty street, the same silent buildings. I turned back, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. That's why I saw it. A faint outline, just beyond the reach of the lamplight, barely visible against the darkness. A figure, standing motionless, watching me. I froze, unable to breathe. My stomach twisted in knots as I stared at the silhouette, my mind racing. Was it the same creature from the alley? No, this figure was different. It wasn't grotesque, but it was just as terrifying. It was more human, yet still wrong in some way I couldn't explain. I took a cautious step forward, but the figure didn't move. It stood there, like a statue, unmoving, as if waiting for me to come closer. But something deep inside me screamed to stay away. I could feel its presence pulling at me, drawing me in, and I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. I took another step, closer now, and as I did, the figure's face began to come into focus. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized it, a face I had seen only in fragments, a face that haunted my memories. It was me. Or rather, a twisted reflection of me. Its eyes were hollow, dark, like empty pits. Its skin was pale, almost gray, stretched thin over the bones. But the worst part was its smile. It was a grin that seemed to stretch too far, too wide, like it had been forced into place. A grotesque parody of happiness, mocking me, mocking my very existence. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice low and raspy, like the sound of dry leaves being crumpled. "You know you want to." My knees buckled beneath me. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The figure took a step forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, like it was gliding through the air. The smile on its face widened, if that was even possible. My breath quickened, panic flooding my senses. It was too close now. I could feel its cold presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. "You've always known," it murmured, the voice so familiar, so horrifyingly intimate. "You've always known the truth, but you were too afraid to see it." I shook my head, trying to back away, but I couldn't. My body refused to move. It was as if I had been frozen in place, locked in the grip of whatever this thing was. And then, in that moment, I understood. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. This was something that had been with me all along, something that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The fear I had felt in the alley, the feeling that I was being hunted, it all made sense now. The creature, or whatever it was not just some external force. It was a part of me. A part of my past that I had buried so deep, so far down, that I had forgotten it. But it hadn't forgotten me. It had been waiting. "You can't escape," the figure whispered again, its voice like a cold wind, chilling me to the bone. "You never could." The smile twisted into something darker, something even more monstrous. And for the first time, I realized with a horrible clarity, this wasn't just a nightmare. This was my reality. I had to move. My mind screamed at me to run, to break free, but my legs felt like lead, frozen in place. My heart pounded so hard in my chest it was as if it would tear through my ribs. The figure in front of me, that monstrous reflection of myself, took another step forward, and I felt its presence encroach on my soul. The street around us, the familiar cityscape, seemed to blur and melt as if the world itself was folding in on itself, spiraling into some dark, impossible dimension. "You can't run from me," the figure whispered, its voice slithering into my ears, wrapping around my thoughts like a choking vine. "You've always known the truth, deep down. The truth about who you are, about what you did." I stumbled back, my feet skidding against the pavement, but there was nowhere to go. The street, once wide and open, now felt like a narrow, suffocating tunnel. The walls of the buildings seemed to close in, the shadows growing thicker, more oppressive. I could hear the hum of the street lamps, but it felt distorted, like it was coming from some otherworldly place. A place where reality no longer made sense. "You can't escape your past," the figure continued, its lips curling into that twisted, mocking grin. "I am your past. The part of you that you tried to bury." I shook my head, trying to deny it. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. I was just imagining things. My mind was playing tricks on me. But the more I fought against it, the more the figure seemed to gain power over me. Its words echoed in my mind, clawing at my sanity. "No," I muttered, more to myself than to it. "This isn't real. It's just a dream." The figure's smile widened, its eyes dark and hollow, pulling me in. "A dream?" it hissed. "Do you really think this is just a dream? You've always known the truth. You've always known what you did to me." The words hit me like a physical blow, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of recognition. It wasn't just the figure's voice that was familiar, it was the words themselves. The guilt. The fear. I knew this pain. I had buried it so deeply, locked it away in the darkest corners of my mind, but it was all coming back now. I had done something terrible. I had hurt someone. And whatever this thing was, this creature, was the consequence of that. It wasn't just a reflection. It was the manifestation of my own guilt, of the part of me that I had tried to forget, the part of me that had never forgiven myself. My vision blurred as the air around me grew thicker. I gasped for breath, but it felt like the oxygen was being sucked from the space. The figure took another step forward, its cold, clammy fingers reaching out toward me. "You can't escape," it whispered again, its breath foul, like death itself. "You belong to me now." I stumbled back, my back hitting the cold stone of a building. I had no way out. I was trapped, surrounded by the walls of my own mind, cornered by the consequences of my past. But even as the figure loomed closer, something in me snapped. I wasn't going to let this thing consume me. I wasn't going to let it take control of my mind, my soul. Not again. I clenched my fists, feeling the sharp bite of my nails against my palms, the only thing that reminded me I was still alive. No! I shouted, my voice trembling, but growing stronger with each word. I won't let you win. I won't let you control me. The figure faltered, its face flickering, like it wasn't sure how to respond. For the briefest moment, the shadows around it seemed to waver, as if they were unsure of their hold on me. I seized the opportunity. With all the strength I had left, I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I didn't care if I was heading deeper into the heart of this nightmare. I just needed to get away from that thing. From the darkness. I didn't look back, but I could feel it. The shadows stretching behind me, following me, pursuing me like a relentless predator. The ground beneath me seemed to shift again, and the buildings blurred, disorienting me. I was lost in a maze of twisting alleyways, the air thick and suffocating, every corner feeling like a dead end. But as I ran, something else happened. The noise of my footsteps, the sound of my breath, the frantic pounding of my heart, all began to fade. The world around me seemed to grow quieter, quieter still, until it was just me and the shadows. Then, suddenly, I stopped. The street before me had vanished. I was standing in a vast, empty void. No buildings. No walls. Just an endless, pitch-black expanse that seemed to stretch on forever. I turned around, but there was no way out. The shadows, the figure, everything, it was gone. But so was everything else. And then I heard it. A whisper, far off in the distance. It was a voice, familiar and haunting. You can't run from me. My body froze, every muscle locked in place. I knew that voice. I knew it too well. But it wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from all around me, echoing in my mind, in my very soul. The darkness was closing in again. And this time, there was nowhere left to hide. I was no longer sure if I was awake or still trapped in the same twisted dream. The void around me stretched on endlessly, a churning sea of darkness that pulled at my sanity. Every direction seemed to lead into more nothingness, and every sound, every whisper, felt like a lie, a mocking reflection of my own fractured mind. I could feel it now, that weight pressing down on my chest. The voice that had echoed through the void was familiar, but not in the way I wanted. It wasn't my own. It wasn't anyone I could recognize. It was as though the shadows themselves were speaking, each one taking on a voice, a personality, a history. You thought you could escape, it whispered again, this time closer. The voice curled around my thoughts like smoke, suffocating me, forcing me to listen, to understand. But you never left. You've been here all along. My breath came in shallow gasps, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the suffocating grip of the shadows. The ground beneath me felt like it was made of something soft, like the surface of a dream, shifting beneath my feet with every step. I tried to move, but the darkness kept pulling me back, wrapping around my ankles like invisible chains. You're trapped, the voice said again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a chorus, 100 voices that seemed to be all around me, each one familiar, each one laced with a different memory. We are all trapped, and we are all waiting. I fought against it. I fought against the fear, the panic, the overwhelming sensation that I was losing myself to something I couldn't see, couldn't understand. The figure, the shadow that had followed me, taunting me, revealing my deepest fears, was gone, but its presence lingered in the air like a heavy fog, impossible to escape. I tried to move again, but the weight in the air was too heavy. It felt like it was pulling me down, making every movement a struggle. The darkness pressed in, tightening around me like a vice, until I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. And then I saw it. In the distance, just on the edge of the void, there was a flicker of light. Faint, weak, but unmistakable. It wasn't much, but it was something. A glimmer of hope. Or perhaps it was just another illusion, another cruel trick my mind was playing on me. I forced myself to move toward it, each step a battle against the suffocating pull of the shadows. The darkness resisted, the void pushing back, trying to drag me down into its depths. But the light, faint as it was, called to me, urging me forward, promising an end to the nightmare. The further I walked, the more the darkness seemed to change. The air around me shifted, and I could hear something. A sound, low and guttural, like a distant growl or the rumble of thunder, echoing through the void. It was like a warning, a reminder that there was still something out there, something far worse than the shadows. The light ahead grew brighter, but it didn't feel like a beacon of salvation. It felt wrong, like it was pulling me into something even darker, something deeper. I reached out toward it, desperate for an answer, for a way out. But as I took another step, I saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the light. It wasn't the same as the creature I had seen before. This was something more intricate, more detailed. Its shape was humanoid, but its limbs were too long, too twisted. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unfeeling, burning into me. "Do you see it now?" the voice whispered again, only now it was not a whisper at all. It was everywhere, all at once. "Do you see what's been following you? What's been waiting for you?" I tried to move back, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The shadows had found me again. This time, they weren't just around me. They were inside me, filling my chest, my mind, my soul. They knew everything. They knew every mistake, every moment I had tried to bury. And they weren't going to let me forget. "You can't run from me," the figure said, its voice now a deep, resonant growl like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "You've been running for so long, but you've never left. Not really. Not in here." The figure stepped closer, its limbs stretching and contorting in unnatural ways, but it never fully came into the light. It was like it existed on the edge of reality, never fully in focus, always just out of reach. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The light flickered, then went out. I was left in complete darkness. It was silent now. The shadows no longer pressed against me, no longer tugged at my soul. But the stillness, it was worse. It was more terrifying than any noise, any creature, any threat I had faced before. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. "You are mine," the voice whispered once more, and this time it was not an echo. It was a truth, undeniable and final. "And you always will be." The darkness closed in again, and I felt myself falling deeper into the unknown, into the void, into the shadows of the unspoken. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.